Once upon a time, in a dense forest, there lived a man who was known to the villagers as the Wolf Man. He was called so because he had an uncanny ability to communicate with wolves. The villagers were both fascinated and terrified of him. The Wolf Man lived in a small, wooden cabin deep in the forest. He had built it himself, using the skills he had learned from his father. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, and a small stream flowed nearby, providing him with fresh water. Every morning, the Wolf Man would wake up early and go for a walk in the forest. He would often encounter wolves during his walks, and they would greet him as if he were one of their own. The Wolf Man had a special bond with these creatures. One day, a young girl from the village got lost in the forest. She had wandered too far while picking berries and couldn't find her way back. As night fell, she grew more and more frightened. She had heard stories about the Wolf Man and hoped he would find her. Meanwhile, the Wolf Man was on his evening walk when he heard the distant cries of the girl. He followed the sound and soon found her sitting on a rock crying. The wolves had already surrounded her, but they kept their distance, sensing her fear. The Wolf Man approached the girl gently and spoke to the wolves in their language, telling them to back off. The wolves obeyed, and the girl looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He extended his hand to her and said, "Don't be afraid. I'll take you home." The girl hesitated for a moment, but then took his hand. The Wolf Man led her through the forest, and the wolves followed at a respectful distance. As they walked, he told her stories about the forest and the animals that lived there, trying to calm her fears. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the girl's parents were waiting anxiously. They had been searching for her all evening and were overjoyed to see her safe. The Wolf Man handed her over to them and turned to leave, but the girl's father stopped him. "Thank you," the father said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We have always been afraid of you, but now we see that you are a friend to us in the forest." The Wolf Man nodded and disappeared back into the trees, his heart warmed by their words. From that day on, the villagers no longer feared the Wolf Man. They would often see him walking with the wolves, and they would wave to him in greeting. The Wolf Man had always been a part of the forest, but now he was also a part of the village. The young girl never forgot the night she was rescued by the Wolf Man. She would often visit the edge of the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Sometimes she would see him in the distance, and he would wave to her before disappearing into the trees. Years passed, and the girl grew up, but she never lost her fascination with the forest and the Wolf Man. She became a storyteller, sharing tales of the Wolf Man and his adventures with the next generation of villagers. The legend of the Wolf Man lived on. The Wolf Man continued to live in his cabin, surrounded by the wolves he loved. He grew old, but his bond with the wolves never weakened. They remained his loyal companions, and he remained their protector. The forest was his home, and he was its guardian. One winter, the Wolf Man fell ill. The wolves sensed that something was wrong and stayed close to his cabin, howling mournfully. The villagers, too, noticed his absence and grew concerned. They decided to venture into the forest to check on him. When they reached his cabin, they found the Wolf Man lying in bed, weak and frail. The villagers brought him food and medicine, and the wolves watched over him, never leaving his side. The girl, now a young woman, stayed by his bedside, holding his hand. The Wolf Man's strength slowly returned, thanks to the care of the villagers and the loyalty of the wolves. He was touched by their kindness and realized that he was no longer alone. The forest and the village had become one, united by their love